Hello everyone, and welcome to today's event with Professor Louis Dartnell. He is a professor of science communications at the University of Westminster, and he, in addition to doing research on astrobiology, is also a prolific science communicator, doing a lot of public engagement events, and he has also written many books. In particular, today we will be talking with Professor Dartnell about his book Origins, How Art's History Shaped Human History. So welcome, Professor Dartnell, and thank you for speaking with us.
Hi there, thank you very much for having me on. I've been looking forward to this.
Thank you. And we'll start by asking the standard question we ask with all our participants, that you started as a scientific researcher writing science articles, and then you switched to public communications and writing a popular science book. So what made you do this transition?
Just curiosity, to be honest. So I still am active in research. I'm still a research scientist based at the University of Westminster in London. But even through the course of my PhD, my master's and then PhD, and then postdocs and permanent post, I've always enjoyed not just doing the research, but telling people about it on the side as well. I think for me at least personally, being just a science researcher, I think I'd find a little bit dry, a little bit too much. Whereas mixing that with some more creative and imaginative things on the side, with the communication and writing and journalism, I find that gave me a nice balance in my life and in my career. And what I've been really lucky with is 3 years ago now, a post came up at the University of Westminster for a professorship in science communication. So I could keep up my research in astrobiology and looking into the possibility of life on other planets. And the other 50% of my time is now formally spent on science communication. So my latest book, Origins, which we'll be talking more about later, was written whilst underneath this professorship at the University of Westminster.
Well, these are very difficult days for a science communicator with all these misinterpretations of science going on, not just around COVID, but everything. So we'll talk quite a bit more about science communications. But first, we wanted to talk a bit about your book, which is very interesting to all our listeners. So I would start that discussion by asking you, why did you get interested in writing about human origins specifically, and which may be considered a little bit of shift from your research in astrology?
So actually, maybe it makes sense to put Origins, the latest book, into context with the other books that I've written. And Origins is my fourth book, I think. And the first book that I wrote is much more closely related to my field of science and astrobiology. And then that book is called Life in the Universe, A Beginner's Guide. And I wrote that while still doing my PhD at UCL, in fact. And it's very much tries to do what it says on the cover. It's very much trying to be a beginner's guide, an introduction to this whole broad area of interdisciplinary science, of looking at the possibility of life on other planets, which is a bit of biology, a bit of chemistry, a bit of geology and planetary sciences and astrophysics, and bringing all of those together into this book to explain why scientists like myself think there's a very reasonable chance of finding extraterrestrial life, hardy bacteria on Mars or Europa, or if you've seen on the news in the last week, possibly, just possibly, in the acidic clouds of Venus. So that was my first book, which is written very much about my field of science. My second book was an illustrated children's book with Dorling Kinsley about exploring the solar system and where you would go on holiday. If you could jump on a spaceship and go on holiday anywhere in the solar system, where would you go and what would you most like to do? What souvenirs would you want to bring home that you couldn't get anywhere else in outer space? Or what photographs would you want to remember to take that was of a unique view, something you would never be able to see anywhere else or back on Earth? And then The Knowledge, my last book, was my first proper big book, if you see what I mean. This is now with a proper big publishers. It had lots of translation rights. It's been published around the world. And that is the knowledge how to rebuild our world from scratch. It's all about if there's some kind of global catastrophe and everything around us that we take for granted were to disappear, some kind of apocalypse, let's say, how could you go about recovering and rebuilding everything from the ground up? Could you accelerate your passage back through this network of science and technology and rebuild industrial civilization as quickly as possible? If you got the most useful stuff written down so it doesn't get forgotten to history again. So with the knowledge, of course, it's not actually about the end of the world. I'm not a prepper. I'm not a survivalist. I don't live in Utah in a bunker with lots of shotguns. I don't really think the world is about to end. But I think, again, as a scientist, this notion of the loss of everything in our everyday lives is a really good way of peering behind the scenes, asking these questions about what do we take for granted? How does it work? Could you make it or do it for yourself if you ever had to? So the knowledge is really just about the history of science and technology, about how humans have used their intelligence and invention to build the modern world. And what I tried to do with this new book, with Origins, is pull out on that zoom, that perspective even further, and look at not how human ingenuity and resourcefulness and scientific discoveries have made the modern world we live in, but how features of the planet itself that we live on has had a guiding influence through history, how features of planet Earth have been critical to the human story. So it's a big history book. It looks at the whole of human history from our origin as a species through to the formation of the modern nations and globalization and the world we find ourselves in today, over just about 300 pages. There's quite a lot of stuff to get through. But it was a very long answer to a short question. But this latest book, I see it at least as a continuation of the sort of topics and themes I've been writing about since the beginning.
So in this book, you talk about how various geographic events have made us humans into what we are today, and that both biologically and psychologically. So, in this regard, what's your most favorite example?
So, in fact, I think my favorite example from the whole book is one of the later sections in Origins in the book, where I'm looking at how there's a distinctive fingerprint or signature of planetary processes in even political maps, how people choose to vote. And there's a map that I show in the book in Origins, and if you can't get hold of it, don't worry about it. It's available on the internet. In fact, if you've got a browser, if you're looking on a laptop right now, you can go to originsbook.com, scroll to the bottom of that page, and there are some educational resources that I've made freely available. There's some PowerPoints, there's some PDFs, and you can look at one of those and find this map where I've shown the voting behavior, the voting pattern in the southern states of the US, which perhaps not surprisingly is a very Republican area of North America. It's red. It voted almost overwhelmingly for Donald Trump in the most recent presidential election. But arcing its way, curving its way through these red Republican southern states in the US is a thin crescent of blue, of Democrat voting counties. And this is curious because that feature in the political map doesn't correspond to anything you can see in the geography. There's a lot of Democrat counties on the banks of the river Mississippi River, but this crescent doesn't correspond to hills or mountains or anything you can actually see physically. But if you peer underground, if you overlay on top of this political map a geological map and look at the pattern of rocks that are about 80, 75 million years old, you see a really strong connection, a very strong correlation between rocks beneath your feet, which is 75, 80 million years old, and people voting Democrats, people voting for Hillary Clinton rather than Donald Trump in the last election. And I say you can see in the PowerPoint that is freely available on the book website on originsbook.com, you can see these maps being layered on top of each other as you go through the PowerPoint. And this makes no sense at all, right? You know, these people aren't geologists. They're not digging underground and going, the rocks in my backyard are 100 million years old. That means I have to vote for Donald Trump and I wanted to vote Democrat. There's no direct link from the geology to political interests or political affiliations. But what there is a long chain of cause and effect, of one thing leading to next, back through centuries of human history and then tens of millions of years of our planet's history. And those rocks, which are 80 million years old, were laid down during the Cretaceous period of Earth's history, when the sea levels were much, much higher and the ocean lapped right up through the middle of North America. It was called an inland sea across the North American continent. And so the rocks laid down back then were effectively thick deposits of seafloor mud. They give you a mudstone. And when that rock is buried and then eroded and revealed again, it gives you a very, very fertile soil that was realized in the early 1800s was very, very productive for growing cotton, cash crops that people in the early 1800s could sell back to Europe for things and the machinery that they needed and the tools that they needed. And unfortunately, in that period of history, growing cotton involved slave labor. So people were abducted from Africa, taken across the Atlantic Ocean, and forced to work on the cotton plantations along that particular band of rocks. And even today, after hundreds of years after the American Civil War, after emancipation from slavery, after the civil rights movement, still today, the greatest density of Black African American people live along that particular band of Cretaceous age rocks. People that tend to vote for Democrat ideals rather than Republican politics. So there's this lovely interplay, I think, in this particular example between political factors and planetary factors, going through sociology, culture, economics, agriculture, and then down to soil types and rocks and planetary process that happened tens of millions of years ago. So yeah, I think if you're sharing your screen there, you found that particular map from the book. I wonder actually if you're going.
Yeah, so we had posted about this specific example.
Oh, well, there you go.
One of our favorite examples. So days ago when we posted about this event, we said that we are going to talk about this black belt, which you mentioned.
Exactly. So I'm glad that came up as the first example then.
Yeah. Yeah, but thanks a lot for explaining it to our audiences much better than we could. So we'll move on to the next questions then. And since you discussed that the evolution of human beings have required so many conditions to be exactly what they are for our appearance on Earth, so do you think that this is kind of a chance happening, and anything changed would have made the appearance of human beings impossible? And in that context, do you expect intelligent human beings evolving in other planets?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think with books like Origins or big history books in general, you've got to be careful of geographical determinism. I'm not trying to argue that the way the world turned out or the way that history played through was inevitable. I'm not saying it couldn't possibly have gone any other way. But I think it is nonetheless important to appreciate that although history is of course determined by people and by kings and queens and generals and emperors, and random events and things like culture and sociology and anthropology and politics and economics, that beneath all of those top level causes, explanations, there lie deeper explanations, things to do with the rocks beneath your feet or the pattern of circulation in the atmosphere or where different resources can be found. That, of course, these geographical or geological or planetary forces have had an influence, have had an effect on human history, on our story. But if we look at perhaps one of the most important questions about where did humanity come from in the first place as a species, I talk about in chapter 1 of Origins, how we evolved in East Africa, in the Great Rift Valley. I wonder, in fact, if I can share my screen. Host disabled,
Sure,
attendee screen share. Well, that's just rude.
I will make you co-host.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Because I could then actually just, thank you. I could actually just show you.
Sure, yeah, that'll be great. It's just the default setting of Zoom.
So are you now able to see?
Yes, I can see
this map. So chapter 1 of the book Origins goes right back to our very origins, our fundamental origins as a species, and how we evolved in East Africa and specifically in the Great Rift Valley, which incidentally is where I spent my own childhood. I grew up in Nairobi in Kenya, within a stone's throw of this Great Rift Valley, this tectonic fracture in the skin, in the crust of planet Earth. And we've known for a long while that this has been crucial for human evolution, for driving our evolution from tree-swinging ape-like creatures, hairy ape-like creatures, to naked human-like creatures that walk upright. We're bipedal. But what hasn't been clear is, what was it specifically about the Great Rift Valley that drove human evolution to create creatures that were so intelligent? And the answer that's been emerging over recent years is that there is a confluence, there's a coming together of planetary features in this part of the Earth in East Africa. There's the tectonic fracture of the Great Rift Valley, which has an effect on the weather and rainfall and where that water gets funneled down into a system of lakes that you can see on this map here. And these lakes interact with climactic cycles, the so-called Milankovitch cycles, which come from wobbles of Earth's tilt or orbit around the sun. And the Great Rift Valley amplifies those effects. So the Great Rift Valley goes through periods of very unstable, chaotic climate. And we evolved our intelligence to outthink that chaotic environment. Intelligence allows you to survive if things are unpredictable, if they're constantly changing. So it seems like humanity, as well as other hominin species, other human-like species that gave rise to Homo erectus or Neanderthals, for example, we are children of plate tectonics. Our evolution was driven by this earth-moving process in East Africa. Now, the conclusion from that might be, if for whatever reason the East African Rift Valley never opened up, would humans have evolved? And the answer is, well, probably not. But you might find a similar tectonic feature somewhere else on the planet at some other similar period in the Earth's history, and therefore that same process of unstable climate might have driven the evolution of intelligence in perhaps other ape-like species or maybe other animal species. You can't tell, but it does seem to be a very convincing explanation for why our ancestors developed intelligence and big brains.
So I will continue asking questions, but just a reminder to our listeners that if you are on the Zoom call and you want to ask any questions, you can raise your hand and I will let you unmute and speak, or you can post questions on the Facebook live thread and I'll ask those questions to Professor Dartnell as well. But carrying on with our questions, you had just mentioned the issue of determinism, which I think is a common risk that not just from your book, but also other famous books like Jared Diamond's Guns, Jumps, and Steel, that there's this argument that geological and ecological features have shaped a considerable part of human history. So, how would you counter that risk of saying that what happened in our history was inevitable? For example, like European colonization was inevitable.
Yeah, like I say, it is a good point, and it's something we've already touched upon, that I think you can reject geographical determinism. You can reject the argument that something was inevitable or always was going to be that way, always had to be that way. But that's not the same as saying a cause was important, or there has been a significant influence from something, or things may turn out broadly similarly, even if you'd rerun history several times and push the reset button and played it again just to see what would happen. And I think a really good example of that is when in Origins in the book, I'm talking about the global wind machine. So the pattern of atmospheric circulation around the planet and how that drives and creates patterns of winds blowing in different directions around the Earth. And in fact, I'm pretty certain I have a picture of that. So just to show you briefly, this is how we've come to understand how the winds blow around planet Earth. This is just basic physics and planetary science. You could, and in fact, the same processes are generating the atmospheric circulation of winds on Mars or Venus or Jupiter or Saturn. This is a fundamental property of atmospheres around planets. You can calculate this from first principles. And on Earth, this created a system of winds around the world with the trade winds and the westerly winds and the monsoon system, of course, around the Indian subcontinent. The monsoon system is the dominant wind pattern in that area of the world. And in our history, it happened to be European navigators who started building very long range trade links across the Atlantic Ocean, across the Pacific Ocean. The Portuguese, first with Vasco da Gama, basically broke into the Indian Ocean, and through force, through having ships which had lots of cannons on them and soldiers, started dominating the trade that already existed in the Indian Ocean with Islamic traders and Chinese sailing ships. But in our history, it tended to be the European powers that came to dominate those long-range trade routes and therefore dictated through this process of colonization and empire building the shape of the modern world. But it didn't happen to be that way. At the beginning of the 14th century, Europe was a backwater. We were ill-educated. We weren't particularly technologically advanced. And in fact, China had been technologically and philosophically and, if you like, scientifically more advanced than Europe for centuries. And maybe history could have played out differently. Maybe in the early 1400s, when the Admiral Zheng He was exploring around the Indian Ocean, reaching as far as Mombasa and the East African coast, maybe Chinese exploration would have gone further. Maybe Chinese explorers would have found the route using the trade winds and the westerly winds across the Pacific Ocean to the Americas. Maybe the Americas would have been discovered by Chinese explorers, not European explorers. It could easily have happened if things have played out differently in history. But what you can say with confidence is that whether it had been European explorers or it had been Chinese explorers or Indian explorers or anyone else, whoever did it would have had to have placed their trade routes in roughly the same places, because that is dictated by the pattern of winds. That is dictated by where the trade winds blow, and that is dictated by where the westerly winds blow that bring you back across the ocean in the opposite direction. So regardless of whether it was European or Chinese or Indian or Korean explorers who had this age of exploration and discovery and building these trade routes, they would have to have used the same system of winds because that is universal. And those are the sort of ideas I play with in this book, in Origins, about what you might expect to be universal about history compared to the things which are random. Who happens to win a war because a general makes a bad decision on the battlefield, or a ship gets hit by a storm, or any other number of random occurrences to do with earthquakes or volcanic eruptions. You can look at grand themes and trends and argue that they would have an effect no matter what, in terms of general influence.
In your book, you also talk about the evolution of intelligence, and in particular, you make this very interesting connection between the ice ages and the human tools that we find and their connection to skill and intelligence. So do you want to explain briefly to our listeners how that connection appears?
Yes, we talked. Again, I'm just going to go to the map that I've got. And if anyone's interested, I've made all of these maps from the book freely available on the website. And we've talked a bit about how humanity evolved here in the East African Rift Valley. And that was our cradle, that was our birthplace in evolutionary terms. But of course, humanity didn't remain in our cradle. We dispersed, we migrated out of East Africa, and we've come to be the most widely dispersed animal species on the planet. And what enabled us to disperse so widely around planet Earth was another climactic period. And this was the most recent ice age. And people might be familiar with the last ice age from documentaries on TV or reading science magazines or going to a museum and seeing some kind of diorama set up with a woolly mammoth and some ancient human ancestors wearing furs with a spear trying to kill the woolly mammoth. But what I think a lot of people don't realize is that that ice age is only the most recent in a series of 40 or 50 ice ages. Our entire planet is in a particularly unstable period of climatic history, and it is fluctuating back and forth between ice age, interglacial, ice age, interglacial. And during the last ice age, humanity was able to migrate out of Africa and across the continents of planet Earth because the ice sheets that grew across mainly the northern hemisphere they're up to like 4 kilometers thick in some places. And these huge ice sheets drew so much water out of the oceans that global sea levels fell by over 100 meters. And it exposed lots of seabed as dry land. Our ancestors could just walk from one continent to another without having to get their feet wet. And most importantly, our ancestors were able to walk across what's known as the Bering Land Bridge between northeast Siberia and northwest Alaska. We're able to walk from Eurasia into North America and then head down the coast into South America. And by doing that, we became the first human species that reached the Americas. Homo erectus had got a long way across Eurasia towards Indonesia. The Neanderthals had populated Europe, but Homo sapiens, our species of humanity, was the only human species to ever reach into the Americas. And then with the thawing out of the last ice age, the melting of the ice sheets, the rising of the sea levels, the eastern and western hemispheres, Eurasia and the Americas, once again became severed from each other. The Bering Land Bridge sunk beneath the waves. And so, in effect, people living in Eurasia and Africa and Australia, Eurasia, and the kind of Eastern Hemisphere, became separated from the Western Hemisphere, from the Americas. We had an independent experiment in agriculture, in civilization, in building societies. And it was only sort of 20,000 years later when Europeans, as we mentioned already, built ships that were sturdy enough to cross the Atlantic with Columbus, that these two great populations of humanity came back into contact with each other again, right at the beginning of the 1500s. But it was the Ice Age, as you say, that was a critical climactic feature that enabled us to populate and reach the Americas as a species.
Well, I was asking also about the evolution of intelligence and the connection of Ice Age and stone tools.
So we've talked about the evolution of intelligence in East Africa and how that is due to fluctuations in Earth's climate, which are driven by the Milankovitch cycles. And those Milankovitch cycles, I say, are wobbles in Earth's orbit, are also what drives the rhythm, the beat of the Ice Ages. So I don't think the Ice Ages themselves drove the evolution of intelligence, but they are another facet of the same cosmic effect of Earth's orbit. But the fact that we were so intelligent when we migrated out of Africa meant that Homo sapiens was able to survive in Europe despite it being in the depths of an ice age. We had the intelligence to use fire. We had the intelligence to invent basically the sewing needle, so we could sew clothes together and sew furs together so that we were warm enough in Ice Age Europe. So that there is that effect of the Ice Ages and human tool use.
So this issue of intelligence and its connection with geography is another thorny issue for science communicators that people might immediately want to correlate with the distribution of various ethnicities around the world and kind of connect that to the geography and through geography to these factors like intelligence. So when you are doing science communication, how do you carefully handle this problem?
What do you mean, sorry, about ethnicities around the world?
So like different parts of the world, like say Europeans and Africans, they have had like different geographical histories. Like as you mentioned, the Europeans were going through the Ice Age, they had to develop technologies like stitching fur and fire and so on. And so people will look at this difference of ethnicities through geographical positions, connect that to the difference in geography. And since the difference of geography was a driving factor in these issues like intelligence, they might make this connection of ethnicity and intelligence directly, which is common risk. So,
sorry, I see what you mean. Yes, some people might make that kind of argument, and I say geographical determinism in that sense. Those sort of arguments were made, back in the 1920s, 1930s. They are wrong, of course. That those sort of arguments have been roundly rebutted and rejected. And it's not the case that Europeans were somehow inherently more intelligent or more capable than people living elsewhere around the world. And as I said, in fact, people in Europe were behind advances in India or advances in China for hundreds of years. Civilization didn't start in Europe. It started along the banks of the Indus River Valley. It started along the banks of the Yangtze and the Tigris and Euphrates. So different parts of the world have had different events and different trajectories, but no ethnicity, because of its geography, is inherently different.
so on this continuing theme, you are a very, very prolific science communicator. So what do you think as a science communicator in these days? What are the biggest challenges?
So I think you've kind of alluded to one of the most important challenges, which is people's misconceptions, misapprehensions, and certain fields of science, I guess because they're important, but because they're philosophically important or profound, like evolution or the creation of humanity or the origin of the universe, or within my own field of astrobiology, and the possibility of alien life or UFOs, attract a particular sort of person, perhaps, or particular wrong ideas or wrong hypotheses and wrong theories. So one aspect of science communication or science outreach is correcting, I think, those misapprehensions, trying to show people why not vaccinating your child, for example, is perhaps a bad idea for the health of your child and for the health of other children and the rest of society. But I think it's wrong to say that science communication is only about educating the public. This isn't school, it's not university. I think science communication is much more important if it is scientists working in university having open conversations with the general public. And a conversation is necessarily a two-way street. It's not just broadcasting, it's listening as well, listening to what people think, what their ideas are, what their concerns or apprehensions might be, what people are anxious about. And I think that is the important detail of science communication, is having a conversation with the general public as a scientist, and not just trying to educate or trying to correct people. I think that's only a minor component.
Just to remind again our listeners who are with us on the Zoom call that if you have any questions, you can raise your hand and I'll let you unmute yourself and ask. So in terms of science communication, we have a lot of listeners who are students themselves or young researchers, and they are quite eager in future to become science communicators themselves. And what would be your advice to them in becoming a successful science communicator?
I think the best piece of advice I could give is just start doing it. Just give it a go. And I started getting into science communication when I was doing my master's and then PhD. And I just started writing articles, and I started writing for my university student newspaper. I started writing for different websites. And the more you write, the better you get at it. You get stronger at developing your own voice. You get quicker at writing. You get better at beating writer's block and how to form your ideas and write sentences that flow well without you having to think too hard about it. But I think importantly as well, it's the more you write, the more people are likely to come across your work. And in the olden days, 1930s, 1940s, if you wanted to be a journalist, the only way you could do that is to apply for a job at, let's say, the London Times or the New York Times or whichever newspaper in the city where you live. And you would apply to the editor of that newspaper, and you would have to post in newspaper clippings, articles that you'd written that had been published in the newspaper, and you would have a portfolio. You'd have a set of newspaper clippings that you'd written, and you would take that to the editor, and they'd read them and say, yes, I think your writing's good. I'm going to give you a job. Nowadays, you don't have to do that. The internet exists, and it is literally the work of 10 minutes of a coffee break, using free software, using something like WordPress or the alternatives. You can sit down at a computer in a library or your school or your university. You can start your own website. I have lewisdartnell.com. You can make your own website and just start writing. Start posting blogs or articles about things that you find interesting. And not only will that blog give you the urge to write, gives you the reason to write, but it's being a website means that anyone anywhere in the world can find it. It's like having a shop window on your work. And one of the best examples I got of this is one of my friends who used to live in London and now writes for a big magazine in Washington, DC in the States. And all he did is sat down during a coffee break, created a blog post for himself, started writing on it. And at the beginning, no one read it. Like his friends read it, his family read it. But because he had interesting things to say, people would recommend it to their mum or dad, or they would retweet it, or they'd post it on their Facebook page, which meant a few more people started reading and recommend it to other people. And it took off. It kind of, more people started reading it. And then he was offered a job at I say kind of an international magazine. So the best advice I can give you if you want to get involved in science communication, and bear in mind, I've only been talking about writing or journalism. If you want to get involved in radio or podcasts, it is free. You can set up an account using SoundCloud. You can use something no more complicated than a cheap mobile phone to record your voice, to interview people, to start editing together short podcasts, put them for free on the internet. If you want to get involved in being a TV documentary maker, if you want to be the next Richard Attenborough or the next Brian Cox or the next Neil deGrasse Tyson or Alice Jones, all you need to do is use your phone to start recording video. You can use TikTok nowadays, put it up online for free, and people can start watching it and sharing it with each other. The barrier nowadays to getting started is so low that if it's something you want to do, you've got no excuse not to do it. So I would strongly urge and recommend anyone listening now just to give it a try. And it will probably be completely rubbish when you first start. Your first try probably won't be great, but you can improve on it, and then you can improve, and you try, and you work hard, and it will get better, and you'll get more experience, and your audience will grow because they'll recommend it to each other.
That's very useful advice. Thanks. And we have a question from Facebook Live. So Arnav is asking, what kind of change should we expect as a human species if we fail to prevent climate change?
So I mentioned already that it was climatic instability, climate change in East Africa, that drove our evolution and drove our intelligence as a species. But it's not like the current climate change we're seeing because of human industry and all of our cars is going to drive our evolution. It's happening far too quickly, and we're not gonna, it's not on an evolutionary timescale. But I think we're all aware nowadays at exactly what the likely effects of unchecked climate change will be. And it's not just the world gets warmer on average, entire weather systems get displaced. Some places start getting much rainier, some places start getting drier. And fundamentally, the problem is we have to grow food to eat by growing crops in the ground. And if some crops now start getting too wet and flooded, they die. If crops in other places get too dry and drought, they die. We don't have enough food to feed ourselves with. That's fundamentally the problem of climate change, as well as ocean sea level rises and ocean acidification and coral reef bleaching and all the other problems. I was out in India pretty much this time last year, in fact, with the British Council. And when I was in Chennai, the region was currently experiencing a drought. The monsoons had not arrived at the right time or last as long as they had done in previous years. And there was less rain, there was less water, there was less irrigation. It was a problem on a regional scale. And we are seeing more and more of these effects of climate change around the world. California is being burnt by unchecked wildfires at the moment. Yes, wildfires are natural. Yes, they happen anyway, but the ground and the vegetation is drier now because of climate change. Wildfires are more frequent and more extreme, more intense. Hurricanes are getting more frequent and more intense, as well as typhoons and other tropical storms. So those are the effects of climate change that we're familiar with, but it's not like humans are going to evolve because of this current climate change.
Okay. So you had mentioned at the beginning about this recent news about the prospect of finding life on the planet Venus. And in fact, you were quoted by the BBC about your opinions on this very perspective. So, what do you think?
Yeah, so the discovery, what was actually found is that radio astronomers looking at Venus found the telltale fingerprint of a gas called phosphine in the Venusian clouds. Now, phosphine is a curious thing to have found. It shouldn't be there. It's a reactive chemical, a reactive gas. It should have been removed and not been allowed to build up to detectable levels. And indeed, the two processes that we know about on Earth that can produce phosphine is human industry, like industrial chemistry, and life. And you wouldn't expect either of those in the Venusian atmosphere. And so the authors of this study went through and wrote a list of every single chemical reaction pathway that they could think of that could possibly have created phosphine in Venus, whether that was volcanic eruptions or chemistry driven by sunlight, or maybe phosphine was falling in with comets and meteorites or something. And they went through every single possible reaction and had to cross it out because it couldn't produce phosphine in such high levels. And so the conclusion they came to was, well, if we've ruled out everything else, maybe this phosphine is produced by biology. Maybe we've just detected the signs of simple bacterial life forms in the Venusian clouds. Now, of course, I think that would be a very exciting discovery if it were true. But what I strongly suspect is that the answer will turn out to be much simpler, which is there is some other kind of atmospheric chemistry that we don't know about yet that produces phosphine under very high temperatures or high acidities in the Venusian atmosphere. I think it won't be life that turns out to be the answer. I think it will be some unknown chemistry that we discover. But you never know. And it's an exciting discovery either way.
So, you don't think that you need to write another book like Origins about Venus?
Or maybe update my first book, Life in the Universe, and not be so dismissive of Venus, and maybe give it a whole chapter to itself.
Okay, so Pritam has raised his hand, so please unmute yourself and ask a question.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. Hello, Professor Lewis. I just want to hear a comment on a project, actually. You may be heard of the project Pleistocene Park, which is a nature reserve in Russia, which is a kind of project like going back to the last ice age condition. I also heard that they want to bring back the woolly mammoths in the park. The primary aim of this park is to recreate the mammoth state. So what do you think about this project? Is it really going to work, or what kind of, what's the importance of this kind of projects? I don't really understand about this project too much. I just read an article and became curious about that.
Sorry, what is your question?
Did you hear about the project Pleistocene Park in Russia by two scientists, Sergei Zimov and Nikita Zimov?
Sorry, a park in Russia?
Pleistocene Park.
Pleistocene Park.
So he's talking about the project to bring back to life woolly mammoths. So these reconstruction projects that a lot of.
Oh, I see. Sorry. So this whole question is about de-extinction. Yes. And whether genetic engineers, whether biologists can bring back life forms, animals that have fallen extinct. Basically do Jurassic Park for real, I guess. Although Jurassic Park is impossible, that there is no DNA that survives over tens of millions of years. People have said it might be possible to recover enough viable DNA from things like woolly mammoths from the Pleistocene, from the Ice Age, if it has been preserved in permafrost in Siberia or somewhere for long periods of time. So this is not something I know a great deal about myself. I have colleagues who are biologists who work on mammoths and elephants, and I think it's fair to say that they are not hopeful that this is possible. It seems to be something there's a little bit of media hype rather than being scientifically plausible that it's possible to do. And I think there's another question that we should be asking first, which is, should we bring back the woolly mammoth, even if we can? Because there are plenty of species around the planet that are on the brink of extinction now. Maybe we could focus efforts on preventing extinctions with things like climate change, for example, rather than trying to bring something back from extinction that belong to past era, if you see what I mean. The woolly mammoth thrived during the last ice age, and we are currently in an interglacial period. So it's a complex issue. There are arguments on either side. So I've got about another 5 minutes, I'm afraid, before I need to head off.
Okay.
If you've got another 2 quick questions, maybe.
Sure. So just to get back to your science communication activities, because you do so many different kinds of activities, I think it'll be useful for our listeners to know a bit about the various different things that you do, and they may be able to look it up and watch all these various events.
Yes, I mean, as we were talking about already, the best thing that anyone can do for themselves, if they are interested in science communication or having a public profile or working in media, is to set up a website for yourself, a homepage. So if you want to find out about me and the things that I've done, go to lewisdartnell.com, and it shows you the books that I've read and the magazine articles and newspaper articles I've written. So the books I've written, it shows you the TV series I've been involved in. It shows you the events that I've delivered live around the world, including my trips to India, for example. So if you want to see the sort of things that I've done in my career and the sort of things that you could get involved in yourself, look at my website, but also Google, look up on the internet for other people who do the sort of thing that you are interested in. Look them up, look at their CV if it's available, look at the website, see what they say about themselves, and start taking steps towards doing those sort of things for yourself.
So we have another question from Facebook, and after that I will end with the last question. So the question is, in your book, you have talked about the idea of war between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. So can you briefly summarize that for our listeners?
So what we know is that at the time that Homo sapiens were dispersing out of East Africa and migrating around the world, there were other hominin species that had previously migrated out, that were already there in the places that we were migrating through. For example, Neanderthals were in Europe and across some of Central Asia as well. And what we also know is that shortly, within a few thousand years, perhaps 10,000 years after humans migrated through those areas and into Europe, the Neanderthals were no longer there. They disappeared, they died out. So it might be that humans, Homo sapiens, had some kind of war or deliberately killed the Neanderthals. There doesn't seem to be any evidence for that. And indeed, there is a lot of evidence that Homo sapiens and Neanderthals interbred with each other. We have got Neanderthal DNA in our genome for the descendants of those migrant populations that came out of Africa. People indigenous to Africa don't have Neanderthal DNA, but I have Neanderthal DNA in me. People indigenous to India have Neanderthal DNA in them, as their ancestors migrated through that area. And what's interesting is we've also discovered the DNA of Denisovans, who are another species of humanity who are only known from a couple of bones preserved in a cave in mountains in Central Asia. That there are at least 2 other human species already around the world as Homo sapiens were migrating through. And these other human species died out. We probably outcompeted them, but we did also interbreed with them whilst we overlapped, whilst we intermingled.
So our last question for you would be, what's your next book project that we can?
So for me personally, one of the good things that's come out of lockdown in the UK and not being able to leave the house for 3 or 4 months was I was able to sit down and write the proposal for the next book, which my agent took out to the publishers and the publishers have commissioned. And what I want to do with the new book is, in a sense, continue the story from my last book, The Knowledge, through my most recent book, Origins. And for the new book, look at how features of human genetics and our biology and our psychology have been important in history. To look at not planetary science and history, which I did with Origins, but look at human biology and history in this new book. So at the moment, I'm doing a lot of research and reading and just trying to absorb information and ideas at the moment to then sit down and write the new book.
That's very interesting. And hopefully once it comes out, we'll have you again with us.
Yes, by all means, I'd be delighted to.
Thank you so much, Professor Dartnell, for giving us time, and all these very detailed illustrations were very useful in discussing these issues. So thanks a lot for having, and we'll look forward to your book.
No problem at all. Thank you ever so much, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Have a great day. Bye.